Answers are irrelevant. It's the questions that we need to focus on. That's the idea that we're going to cover in this lesson. And we need to think about not just whether we agree or disagree with another person's answer, but think about what type of question that they're trying to answer in the first place. And I want to give you a simple framework to help explain this as clearly and thoroughly as possible so you can start using it as soon as this lesson is over. Because it's by looking at this issue at the question level, seeing where the other person is coming from, whether they realize it or not, that we can stop getting annoyed and frustrated or irritated when other people just don't seem to get us. So rather than just giving you a complete diagram and explain it, I want to instead create it with you, just so you can see how each of these points naturally emerge from each other, so that you can get a deeper understanding of what is going on. So to start creating this diagram, let's begin with a really simple overview. When I think about myself, there are at a minimum two basic parts of me to consider. There is the inside of me and the outside of me. So hopefully this will start to turn up on here. The inside refers to my thoughts, what is going on in my mind, and what my experiences are of those inner experiences themselves. So we can describe all of these as subjective. So, for example, when I say I'm feeling anxious, the only way for you to understand what I mean when I use that word is if you start a dialogue with me. So you can't see my thoughts, you have to ask me about them, and then I can tell you what I'm thinking or feeling subjectively. So it is a private experience. So when I refer to the outside instead, I'm instead talking about the objective aspects of those exact same experiences as well. So what is happening, for example, in my physical brain when I have these experiences, when I have these inner experiences. And the outside refers to those facts that can be empirically tested and checked. So that can be another word we can add onto this list. So you can monitor the hormone changes and the physiology of my brain and which parts of my brain are lighting up when something happens. So on an individual level, what we've got is having a mind versus having a brain. So to understand my mind, you need to have a dialogue with me and you need to interpret. We can add that on as well. We need to interpret what I'm saying, and then we need to ultimately trust that I'm being sincere and trustworthy about the reports from my inner world. But to understand my brain, a dialogue won't get you anywhere. So you can examine me instead with a monologue. So you can report the facts and the data about what it is that you can see. So a really, really clear example would be considering therapy versus science. So a therapist will ask, what does it mean? Referring to my mind, and a scientist will ask, what is it doing? Referring to my brain, if we just overly simplify this down. So, like I say, we can simplify this as studying me is irrelevant. You must talk to me. That's referred to the mind. Talking to me is irrelevant. You must study me, which is my brain. And as a wider point here, then we're also considering this idea of truthfulness versus truth. So to quote Ken Wilber, and more on him a little bit later on from this very, very chunky book, I'm just going to go through one little section, which is just here. This is not so much a matter of objective truth as one of subjective truthfulness. It is not so much whether the map matches the territory, but whether the map maker can be trusted. So on an individual level, we have the inside and the outside of the person to consider. But we don't live in a society by ourselves. We live with other individuals. So we need to also consider the individual versus the collective. And with that, a little 4-part matrix starts to emerge, which I will draw out on here, just to make as clear as possible. So on the x-axis, we've got the inside versus the outside, which I'm going to refer to as the interior versus the exterior, as what we've just covered. And on the y-axis, we've got the individual versus the collective. So, this is where the whole diagram starts to become beautiful, by the way. Everything we've just covered on this is just going to be at the top of this diagram. But when I was saying about this becoming beautiful, now what we've got is something more specific. So if we consider this lower left quadrant, we don't just have the collective, but we've got the interior collective. In other words, the collective culture that the individuals make up. So this will cover topics, things like meaning and language and mutual understanding. It's not just the truth of what I'm saying, or about truth of what I'm saying, or the truthfulness when I'm saying it, but whether you and I can actually understand each other when we use these same terms. So if the subjective refers to the mind, and the objective is referring to the brain, then the intersubjective is referring to the culture. Inter, by the way, just as a prefix, just means between or among. So intersubjective just means between other subjects, or for our purposes here, between other minds. In other words, how can other minds understand our mind? So I'll give you a really simple to illustrate that, because I'm aware that can get a little bit wordy. Let's say that you are living in Britain and that you can speak English fluently. You are driving in an area that you're not used to, and you are looking for directions on where to park your car, so you ask the first person that you see. They say on the right, so you thank them and you park up. It's very easy, it's very straightforward. But let's say that you're driving in Spain and that you don't speak Spanish. It's the same situation. You're driving in an area that you're not used to, you're looking for parking directions, and you ask the first person you see, except this time they say a la derecha in a northern British stroke Spanish accent. So for the Spanish speaking person living in Spain, again, this is very simple. But for the non-Spanish speaking traveller on holiday, this doesn't mean anything at all. So when I say this area here covers things like meaning and language and mutual understanding, this is where it starts to become a little bit clearer. Any individual person exists at the same time within a culture, and the meaning of that culture only makes sense from inside that culture. So we might take it for granted, but there's an inside at two levels. There's the one on the individual level, and there's one on the collective level. So the shorthand for these might be considered the mind and the culture, and it's exactly the same in this last quadrant down here. Just like there is an external aspect to the individual, so we covered it as the brain before, there is an external aspect to the collective as well. And these are the systems that dictate how the person lives, and the wider considerations, the government operations and the laws they have to obey, and the social systems, all the things like that. So to understand other people and relate to them within the same culture, we needed to come to mutual understanding. We need to be intersubjective. To understand other people behaviourally and functionally, we can observe the trends in their behaviours objectively. So we might call this interobjective. Remember, inter just means between or among, so interobjective is just noticing and explaining other people's behaviours from the outside. And I'm aware that this might sound like quite a lot at first, but it gives us this really wonderful way of looking at and analysing and perceiving different aspects of what would otherwise be very confusing aspects of being a human. So rather than reduce our understanding down to any single area on this matrix, we can instead come to understand them on their own terms. And this helps to avoid massive problems that would otherwise be completely unavoidable. It's much more accurate to say that each quadrant can be described with different language rather than immediately criticising it. So we can look at this from the first and the third person viewpoints and then use the appropriate language that is needed for each of them. So for example, in the upper left over here, we can use first person language using the wording of I. So what I'm going to do is for this, I'm going to quote from Ken Wilber's absolutely amazing book, The Eye of Spirit. And I'm going to be quoting all of this from page 19. So when I use direct quotes, I'm going to be referring to just this little section on here. So in this upper left area, just this one here where I've put the sun little diagram, this area is going to include things like consciousness, subjectivity, the self, self-expression, truthfulness, and sincerity. So if you ask me how I'm doing, I'm going to reply with a sentence that is in the first person because it's the only meaningful way to actually answer that question. It's about me reporting my inner experience. But let's say instead that me and you might disagree on something due to our different worldviews and our different cultures. Well, first person singular language really wouldn't be appropriate here. So we'd need to move to the lower left, where we'd use the first person plural. We'd use the wording of we or ours. So again, to quote from that book, this area includes ethics and morals, worldviews, common context, culture, intersubjective meaning, mutual understanding, appropriateness, and justness. Again, this section is inside of the collective. This is wider than the individual. So we'd move from singular to plural, from I to we. If a Christian is speaking to a Muslim about taking his family to church, it would make sense for him to use we or our. Likewise, in reply, the Muslim man will be talking about how he's taking his family to the mosque. So it would make sense for him to use the same language of we and our, but they'd both be referring to different points. So using words like our and we are useful when we're referring to a culture or a meaning or a worldview that you are a part of collectively, but when you're speaking to someone who is outside of that collective. And then we can start to look at the objective facts of the matter that can be observed. And then we can move into third person language when we say things like it. So technically, the upper right box would be it, and the lower right box would be its with a plural, but this is typically just going to be simplified down to as it. So then we've got a first and a third person account for I, we, and it. So again, just to quote from Ken Wilber in that book, this includes things like science and technology, objective nature, empirical forms, so that's like the brain and social systems, and propositional truth in both singular and functional fit. In our previous example, the individual churches and mosques would be described as its, given that they're buildings and that the communities that exist inside of them will be better suited to words like we. And if you were to speak to any individual worshipper, then they will be reporting from a place of I. So, I know it's complicated. I know there's a lot going on here, but it's this really, really beautiful system and this approach. And this is what Ken Wilber refers to as an integral approach. It's AQAL, or AQAL, all quadrants and all levels. I've actually done a really, really simplified overview, believe it or not, there, but it goes into massive, massive detail beyond this. So you can probably start to see already from this where disagreements might start to happen. So let's make this really, really practical with a specific question. And let's say you ask something vague like, does meditation actually work? And you can get into some pretty heated debates unnecessarily because we run the risk of no one quite realizing or knowing which quadrant the other person is speaking towards from their bias. So in a perfect world, let's say everyone agrees, but for different reasons. If someone has a bias towards the upper left box, they'll say, obviously, yes, it does, because they can point towards the subjective feelings of inner peace and calmness and inner experience. But someone else might say, obviously, yes, it does, and show studies about how it changes the levels of stress hormones in the body and how the brain waves noticeably change when a test subject goes into and out of a meditative state. And again, someone else might, because of those findings, say, well, they can be applied more widely in schools and hospitals and for bigger corporations, and look at all the positive benefits there. So they might say, obviously, yes, it does. And then finally, someone else might say, well, this practice of meditation has led to huge cultural insight and growth, which has helped to influence the purpose and the morals of the people inside that culture. So they're going to say, obviously, yes, it does. Everyone is in agreement, but for massively different reasons. But equally, they could disagree without fully realizing why they're disagreeing in the first place. So someone might say, obviously, meditation doesn't work because they mean they've looked at scientific papers which show that the state is temporary at best and that it doesn't have a big impact as other people might assume. But they might be saying that to someone who enjoys meditation for the individual and personal private insights that they get when they experience meditation. If neither of these two people can understand each other's viewpoints and reasons for why they say what they believe and what they believe, then they're never going to get anywhere. That's why I raised this point of language earlier on. It's a question of perception at first, and then we need to use the appropriate language to get our point across. But if we're not even aware of the perception in the first place, then the language is just going to be hopeful at best. So This ties back all the way through to ancient Greek philosophy as well, when Plato discusses the good, the true, and the beautiful. So in that case there, the good, referring to the morals, referring to we, the true, referring to objective truths, the its, and the beautiful, referring to the subjective experience, the I. We can't reduce the good to the true or the beautiful or any variation on that, because it just wouldn't be appropriate or meaningful. It'd be like saying art is better than science. It just doesn't make sense. Discussions of art belong to the realm of the beautiful, and discussions of science belong to the true. Or, on the off chance that you're watching this as a practicing Buddhist, an equal comparison might be something like Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, if you wanted to explore it in that way instead. Right, we've covered a lot, even by my standards on this classroom. So I'm going to give you a quick little summary, because that is a lot to take in. Every single human being exists on 4 very real domains all at once, and none of them can be reduced to the other without a major misunderstanding and problem occurring. There's the subjective aspect, the I, which is the inner private experience. There's the objective aspect, the it, which is the objectively true facts of the matter. Then we can move away from the individual level and over to the collective level. And here we've got the intersubjective aspect, which is the we, which is the culture. And then the interobjective aspect, the its, which is the wider system that the collectives are in. So if we consider the idea of meditation again, we just need to change the language each time to make the question appropriate. So for example, what do I experience when I meditate? Over here, what changes happen in my brain when I meditate? Down here, lower left, what does meditation mean collectively in my culture, and how has it shaped it? And then over here in the bottom right, how can meditation be used in our institutions and systems? Like I said at the start, we need to think about not just whether we agree or disagree with another person and their answer, but what type of question that they're trying to answer in the first place. That is far more important of a consideration than any particular answer. And like I say, believe it or not, that is the simplified theory and explanation of the model. And in the next part of this lesson, we're going to look at applying this to actually make it practical in your life. Just on a personal note, this has been massively useful for me in my life, and has helped to completely sidestep and bypass so many potential arguments, or just to stop them from being arguments in the first place. So it can be a really, really amazing tool to use. So just before we move on to the next part, have a little moment to think for yourself about a specific argument or a specific disagreement that you're currently involved in, or that you have been involved in previously. Where are you coming from? Where are they coming from? And how can you, armed with all this knowledge, help the disagreement come to a more peaceful and respectable conclusion?